We're going to get started tonight. If you have your Bibles tonight, we are simply going to do Exodus chapter 1. And just for the sake of getting started, I want to read the first 10 verses, and we'll get into our study tonight. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Okay, Exodus. A couple of things, just kind of by way of introduction. Throughout the years, I've had folks ask me, "Hey, where do you get all your stuff from? And where'd you hear that? Where'd you learn that? Where can I get that from?" And I'm just going to tell you the truth that it's not always easy. It takes work. There is no magic bullet. And you can't just trust everything that I say. I read some of the most greatest people that have ever gone on before us. My main source for this study is going to be a guy named Arthur W. Pink. He has a book titled Gleanings in Exodus, written a very long time ago. I use the Dallas Theological Seminary's set of commentaries, which is a commentary put together by a bunch of their teachers, professors. I use a commentary called Opening Up Exodus. There's about 3 or 4 others that I use. And even when I'm reading something, just because if it's new to me, I'm like, well, I'm going to look at it from 3 or 4 different sources. And it just takes a little bit of work. If you really want to dig and you really want to get these things, there is no magic bullet. There's no magic book out there that you're going to get it all. It just takes a willingness to dig in and learn. And so I want to challenge you that when you hear things that you haven't heard before, most of them aren't going to be theological, but just facts, stuff. I learned something about Egypt, and it's the way that the land is in Egypt I'd never heard before. And I thought, well, I'm going to go double check that and just make sure. And sure enough, it's true. But I want to encourage you to be willing to study with me. We're basically going to move one chapter at a time. So we will start here in chapter 1. Next week we're going to be in chapter 2. There will be a few times we'll do 2 chapters together. But we're not really going to bounce around. We're going to move through the book together. One of the things that a lot of folks don't know is that most books in the Bible have a central theme. And most of the books in the Old Testament, especially the first 5, tend to have 2 themes. One is kind of historical and the other is theological. For example, the book of Genesis, from a historical point of view, the theme of Genesis is the beginning. We have the beginning of creation. We have the beginning of the world as we know it. We have the beginning of the Jewish nation through Abraham. We have the beginning of faith. It is a book of beginnings. From a theological point of view, the book of Genesis is about God's sovereign choice over who his family is. We see that God just sovereignly chooses Shem out of Noah's 3 sons. Doesn't tell us why. He just does. Shem will be the lineage that everybody will come from. We see that God just chooses Abraham in chapter 12 from the land of Ur and tells him to get up and go to a land. We see God choosing Isaac over the firstborn Ishmael. God choosing Jacob over Esau. God choosing Joseph over his brothers to reign and rule. It is a book that clearly demonstrates the divine sovereign hand of God in choosing who his sons and daughters will be. That's the theological theme of Genesis. Exodus is very similar. From a historical point of view, the book of Exodus is about the deliverance of Israel. It's about Israel relocating out of slavery into the promised land. The Exodus literally means exiting, and it deals with Israel exiting Egypt. So from a historical point of view, that's what this is about. Our study, while we will look at history, our study will focus on the theological teaching, the theological theme of the book of Exodus, which is the theme of redemption. That's what Exodus is ultimately about. Our study is going to focus on the 5 main sections of Exodus dealing with redemption. In chapters 1 through 6, we see the need for redemption, a people in slavery. In chapters 7 through 11, we will see the power of the Redeemer as he demonstrates his power over the Egypt with the plagues of Egypt. In chapters 12 through 18, we will see the character of the Redeemer. We will see that we are purchased, that there is a price that must be paid for redemption, and that price is blood. In chapters 19 through 24, we see what the response of the redeemed is supposed to be to our redemption. It should be obedience and worship and service to God. And then in chapters 25 through 40, we see the Redeemer making provisions for those of us who are redeemed, even in our failures. That even after we're redeemed, and even after God has let us out, we still need provision for sin. And God sets up this divine way of life that points to His holiness and shows mankind how we can stand in right standing with God. This is the theme of Exodus. The key verse highlighting the central theme is Exodus 15:13. Here's what it says. You have led me in your steadfast love, the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them by your strength to your holy abode. All 5 of those themes are found in that one central verse of Exodus 15:13. The central doctrine is clearly redemption. Yet, this is one of the things I love about the Old Testament. God chooses not to communicate this through like theological statements. As we're going to see, God communicates redemption by illustrating it through His actions, through the things that God does. That's one of the things I love about the Old Testament. God reveals Himself to us. He reveals truth to us through symbols, through types, through shadows, through things that He does, illustrating who God is, how God works, the character of God, the nature of God, and His great power to redeem us. So, where are we redeemed out of? That's what I want us to look at tonight. I want to talk about Egypt. I want to talk about Pharaoh. In chapter 1, we see immediately things have turned, the people are in slavery, and the place of bondage, the place of slavery, we see is what we will call typified in Egypt. Egypt is a symbol of the place that we are all redeemed out of, the place that we are redeemed from. It symbolizes the world. Israel's years of slavery, 400 of them, under the control and the power of Egypt, is an illustration of the place that we lived before God saved us, under the power and control of the world. Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh it's not like a name. It's not like Joplin. Pharaoh is a title, like president or pastor. There were many pharaohs. When the Bible simply tells us Pharaoh, it is he who had power and reign and rule of Egypt. Pharaoh, leading the rest of Egypt with him, defies God, oppresses the people of God, makes a plan to destroy the people of God. We see Pharaoh and Egypt as this symbol of the world as a whole, which is hostile towards God and hostile towards God's people. Now, in the end, he couldn't do anything about it. This is the awesome thing about Exodus. It's the awesome thing about God. You're going to find that no matter how many enemies we have, no matter how many pharaohs stand in our way, no matter what is in front of the people of God, when our God chooses to redeem and when God chooses to deliver, there is absolutely nothing, there is no body, there is no nation, there is no group of people who can stop the hand of God. But here, in Exodus 1, Pharaoh and Egypt have the people of God enslaved. And this slavery is an illustration of the dominion of sin in our lives. Quick timeline. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40 says this: the time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. Look what Acts chapter 7 and verse 6 says. And God spoke to this effect, that his offspring would be sojourners in a land belonging to others who would enslave them and afflict them for 400 years. It would seem then, with these two verses and using the Bible to interpret the Bible, that there was about 30 years of peace. There were 400 years that the people were afflicted. 400 years they were in slavery. Exodus tells us the people as a whole were there for 430 years. So Joseph dies, a new Pharaoh's in place, he doesn't have sympathy, and he starts to think these people are going to multiply, and we have got to find a way to keep them from multiplying, oppress them. So 400 years in slavery is ultimately what the people of Israel would suffer in Egypt. And I want to ask the question tonight, why? Why 400 years? Why did God allow Israel as a people, all of them as a nation, to suffer so long? Why did God allow his people to endure the cruelty of slavery for 400 years? God had promised Abraham that his descendants would occupy the land of Canaan. But why 400 years? And why so much pain in the middle? Possibly to prepare them. Possibly. Possibly it could have something to do with that. The land of Canaan was definitely too large for the small size of Israel at the beginning of the 400 years. And so possibly there needed to be time for Israel to grow as a nation before it was time for them to go to Canaan. Maybe it was possible that they endured the suffering like they did to make the land of Canaan, this land of flowing with milk and honey, desirable. Because what we're going to see is that when they do eventually get led out of Egypt, there's this inner conflict with, hey, it was better when we were slaves. And I think that sometimes we have absolutely got to hit rock bottom before we get hungry and thirsty enough for change. Maybe that is possibly part of the reason, but I want to show you some stuff biblically that does tell us a little bit biblically about why possibly 400 years. In Genesis 15, verses 14 through 16, this is what God says to Abram. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation. Look at this interesting statement. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. God told Abraham that in the fourth generation, then they would come back because the iniquity of the Amorites was not complete. God was going to use Israel to punish the wickedness of the Amorites. And he prophesied this. He told Abraham this in Genesis chapter 15. One of the things that fascinates me about God is God's constant ability to tell us what's going to be happening down the road, His ability to always accomplish it exactly like He says it's going to happen, to bring it to pass, even if it's in the fourth generation. You're going to die. You're not going to see it happen yourself, Abram. And we see that for one reason or another, the wrath of God was going to be poured out on the Amorites at a certain point in time, and God was going to use these very people as the instruments of that wrath. That's one of the reasons for the amount of time. But I want to ask it again, but why the suffering? It helps make a little bit of sense of why the 4 generations, why the 400-year span, but why the suffering during that period of time? I think the answer is in Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 through 7. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generation. This is a tough teaching of Scripture that we struggle with. But it's biblical, brothers and sisters. God does visit the iniquity of the fathers and mothers on their children and their children's children and their children's children's children. Now, I want to explain what that means. It doesn't mean that if I go out and I commit some grave sin and I murder a man, that God is going to judge my son Tyron for that murder. All right? This isn't about individual sin. That's not what this is about. In fact, the Bible does teach us that God does not hold the individual sins of a parent on the child. That's not what this is talking about, and that's not what God's talking about here. What God's dealing with is what we might call generational curses, generational sin, generational problems. If I can give you an example in my life, I broke what could probably be called the generational curse in my family. And I was saved at 20 years old, and God radically changed my life, and I have started a new path for my family. But make no mistake about it, the life of my parents still impacts my family to this day. And it impacts my kids to this day. Certain things and behaviors and attitudes and ways of life that I grew up in 30 years ago still have influence and impact on my family to this day. This is an important truth because a lot of us want to feel like we can live how we want to live, do what we want to do, and somehow it's not going to impact our kids. Just nothing could be further from the truth. That's nonsense. What we do as parents directly impacts the life of our children and our grandchildren and their grandchildren. So what's this have to do with 400 years of slavery? You remember, how'd they get to Egypt? Joseph. That's how they got there. Joseph was elevated, right? Remember how Joseph got there? He was sold into slavery and brought to Egypt. By who? His brothers. And now for 3 and 4 generations, his brothers, their children, and their children's children, and their children's children's children would suffer as slaves sold into Egypt. Would Joseph's brothers get away with the wicked thing they did to Joseph? Absolutely not. Because the divine law of sowing and reaping is inescapable. The Bible tells us that whatsoever a man sows, that will he reap. It's a law, brothers and sisters. There is no way around it. God is not mocked. In fact, in the New Testament, Galatians chapter 6, where that verse is, it tells us that whatever a man sows, that will he reap. It starts with these words, do not be deceived. Don't be deceived. You will reap what you sow. There's no way around it. I've seen people before that get saved, or some of them really are saved, some of them aren't, but they supposedly want to turn their life around to God, and they want everything, the mess that they're in, to fix itself right away. It's not going to, it won't happen that way. If your life is in shambles and it's about to break and you just showed up at church, I'm sorry, it's not going to be better tomorrow. You will sow. You will reap what you've sown. But, here's what I tell folks. If you will start sowing the good seed today and keep sowing it, it's a divine law. It's inescapable. You will begin reaping the rewards later. This is a little 2-week try where you're going to, pray at the altar and tell God you're sorry for what you did, and you hope that next week He fixes everything. You might as well go home and go back to living the way you're living. Because you're going to reap what you've sown. But if you will stop sowing that bad seed, and you will start sowing the good seed, things will change. This was one of the principles, and I thank God for it. It's one of the principles that God showed me really early, first 2 months I was saved. This was one of the first principles I learned as a Christian, and it was really helpful for me because I had sown a lot of bad seed. I was a liar. I was a bad person. I was a criminal. And I had hurt a lot of people. And even though I knew I was saved and I knew my life was radically changed and I knew that I'd never be any different, I didn't expect Andrea's mom to believe it. I didn't expect her to treat me different. I didn't expect her dad to believe a word that I had to say. I had just given him 2 or 3 years of a whole lot of seed and a lot of reason to... I was going to reap what I had sown. But I knew this. It's like I just knew it. Keep sowing good seed, Joplin. Stop sowing the bad seed you once used to sow. Stop being the way you once used to be. And you're going to reap a harvest for a while, man, whether you like it or not. They don't know what happened to you. Why would they trust anything you say? But you keep sowing seed. It's been 20 years now. And I'll tell you, I have an incredible relationship with Andrea's parents. That old harvest lasted a couple of years. In some places, it lasted 4 to 6 years. I had sown so much bad seed. And it took time of being faithful and committed to doing the right things and sowing the good seed. So, we must understand there's this divine law of sowing and reaping, and I believe this is one of the reasons that we see them enslaved for 400 years. Now, where are they enslaved? They are enslaved in Egypt. It's a world system that's opposed to God. And in the Bible, Egypt is this world system that pictures the world system. Egypt is a symbol of the world. And I want to show you 4 reasons why. First of all, the land itself is a picture of the world. I want you to look at this image. You don't really have to be able to see it real well from the back. But if you can see that green line that runs up that screen, that's the Nile River. And Egypt is the land on the left side of the Nile and the right side of the Nile. The Nile River literally runs straight through the middle of Egypt. And on the left, you got the western desert. On the right, you've got the eastern desert. And there is no life there. Egypt would be almost an entirely lifeless place if it weren't for the Nile River flowing straight through the middle of it. It was their, and still is, their ultimate source of life. I want you to look at something that's just interesting about the land itself of Egypt. It is dry, it is barren, it is lifeless, it is godless, and yet this source of life that allows it to be sustained flows right through the middle of it. Water, the life-giving water of the Nile, flows right through the middle of it, and the people have no idea where it comes from. There is very little rain in Egypt, and in some cases, months without any. The water for the Nile comes from rains from a land afar off. It pictures the reality that even as sinners, we are sustained by the life-giving river of God, whether we know it or not, whether we appreciate it or not. If it weren't for God sustaining us and God sending the water of life, we would be destroyed. And the people know nothing of it. Number two, Egypt symbols the world system in that it was renowned for its science, its education, its architecture, its ability to be ahead of the times. It's the place of the incredible pyramids. Egypt has been studied for ages. She really is a picture of like the resolve of mankind to build and to show how wise we are and how strong we are. One of the things that is so interesting about all the science and all the building and all the pyramids is that it is connected to death. When you look at the markings and the things that they would engrave in these stones, one of the most prominent features, setting aside, which I'm going to deal with in just a moment, if you set aside the deity of beasts and the animals that they kind of worshiped, one of the primary things is just the concept of death. They believed people lived in the underworld. In fact, wealthy people, pharaohs, kings, people of great influence were often embalmed and buried inside of these great structures. The land of science, the land of the all-knowing man, is a land that still does nothing but produce death. It is not a place of life. It is a place of death. It is this great big stamp of vanity. So no matter how great it is, no matter how powerful they are, no matter how much they've learned, no matter how advanced they are, it all still ends in death. Number three, Egypt worshipped the creature rather than the creator. In fact, in some ways, they worshipped the Nile, or at least the creatures of the Nile. They deified, that's a word that means elevated to the place of God or gods, little g. They deified hundreds of like beasts or images of beasts. Their worship was ultimately created upon their own lusts and their own desires. Their worship was this deification, as is all heathen worship, of the desires and lusts of men. This is what controls natural man everywhere. He is his God. He ultimately worships himself and dies in emptiness. So was the case of Egypt. And fourth, Egypt pictures the world system when we ask the question of how did God's people arrive there? It's real simple. They were born into it. They were born there as slaves. They came into the land of bondage with their father, Jacob. They were born there. We too enter the land of bondage with our father, Adam. All of Adam and Eve's children were born outside of Eden. We are born into the slave world system of sin. Egypt pictures all of that. We see here in chapter 1 the truth about adversity. Adversity produces strength in God's children. Exodus 1:7 says, "But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them." Now, this was the fulfillment of God's promise to Jacob and Abraham. God told them that they would have this numerous nation. Genesis 46, verses 2 through 3. "And God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, 'Jacob, Jacob.' And he said, 'Here I am.' Then he said, 'I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation.'" That nation has grown, has become exactly what God said it was going to become. What comfort should we have in times like these? When it seems like we're being afflicted, and I don't use the word seems in a snarky way. I mean, in a lot of ways the church is being afflicted. The church is being persecuted. Especially the true church. Those who really believe and follow this book and follow the God of this book and stand for the God of this book, the true church. In many ways, we're being afflicted. And we see God in His great knowledge knew exactly what was going to go on in Egypt. And He said, don't be afraid to go down there. Even there, in the face of affliction, I will make you into a great nation. What comfort we should have, knowing that no matter what we go through, no matter what we face, no matter how strong the affliction, our God is able to do what He wants, when He wants, how He wants with His people. Well, the people of God have become large in number. Pharaoh starts to get worried. He sets taskmasters to afflict the people of God. It was a futile plan. It was the finite mind of man laying out his best-made plans against the infinite power and wisdom of God, and it would come to nothing. Pharaoh thought himself wise. He thought his plans were wise. He thought that he was powerful. But here's what 1 Corinthians 3:9 says about it. "For the wisdom of this world is folly with God. For it is written, He catches the wise in their craftiness." And in 1 Corinthians 1:9, God again declares, "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart." How vain it is to plot against God. And in Exodus 1:12, what does it tell us? "But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad, and the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel." This might be the first time that we read a statement like this in the Scriptures, but you will find that from this moment all the way up until the present, throughout the ages, this is the testimony of the church of God, that when it was afflicted and then when it was oppressed, it grew and it multiplied and it got stronger. It's the exact thing that caused the first century church to just explode. It was the persecution itself that caused them to spread. And so they spread and then went everywhere they went preaching. And everywhere they went preaching, people were saved. This is an important lesson about Christianity. We want to try to shelter everybody from pain because we don't want them to leave. We don't want to see them, we don't want to see them go. And so we want everybody to be really sheltered so that they don't experience affliction. That way they feel good and they feel welcomed and they feel wanted and they feel happy. But it doesn't actually produce strong Christians. Your faith is never tested like when you are afflicted and in your time of need. Your faith is never tested on the mountaintop. I've heard the analogy before that it's that blistering sun that forces the roots to go down deep. And what we often do, instead of letting Christians experience the blistering sun and forcing those roots to go down deep, we just surround them with a bunch of manure so they can't fall over. You got to learn a lesson. We are strengthened in affliction. Last year has been hard for all of us. As a pastor, it's been a hard year for me. A lot of emotions that people experience when they're fearful. We're a terrified nation. That's what we are. Church is a terrified church. It's been a hard year for all of us. But I will tell you one thing that has never changed with me. I've actually enjoyed the sifting of the church. I think it's good for us. I'm not trying to be mean-spirited, and I know that COVID's real, and there's some people that are really terrified of it. And there are some people that have needed to miss for legitimate reasons. But I've liked the weeding out in the church of those who aren't serious enough to make it a priority in their life. Believe it or not, it's better for the church. It's better for us when we are afflicted. And when we are forced to decide, are we going to draw near to God or are we going to run and hide? Are we going to put our trust in God or are we going to run and hide? Are we going to be faithful to the commands of God or are we going to hide in a cave? It's healthy. And on the back side of it, a lot of the statistic people, they're all panicking. They're saying, for the first time ever, less than 50% of America is going to church. I'm like, good. Thank God, finally, they had the reason to quit pretending and playing games. Let's get down to business now. The affliction that we face, the affliction that might be around the corner. I do not enjoy affliction, but I do welcome it, if that makes sense. Because I know what God does in the face of affliction. I know that He uses it as this refining tool. I know that in my own life, that some of the times I have drawn closest to God in my life are times when I was at my weakest and I just knew I needed God to deliver me, and I wasn't on the mountaintop and things were hard and I wasn't real sure what the next, what was down the road. It was in moments like that I'm seeking God in such a way, I'm drawing near to God in such a way. Look what Psalm 119:67 says about it. Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word. May it be proved true of us that when we are afflicted, it only makes us grow nearer to God, stronger in our faith, and unshakable in our devotion to God. And it is this preacher's personal conviction. I'm not trying to be mean-spirited. I'm just telling you it's my personal conviction that when affliction comes and people fall away from God, it's often an indication they were never really, truly sold out to Him to begin with. Because God's sons and daughters, we grow stronger through affliction. I'm not saying we don't have our ups and downs, brothers and sisters. I'm not saying that every time affliction comes, we're jumping and shouting because we know we're going to grow stronger. But what I am telling you is that generally, on the backside of it all, somehow, God sees us through. God is with us through it. He teaches us things in it we would have never learned any other way. And we come back out on the other side of that and we look back and we realize we are wiser, we are stronger. God used it. What was meant for evil, God meant for good. And we would not remove the learning experience. We would not remove the strength that we've gained through the affliction. Well, they are numbering. They're growing. And Pharaoh gets his plan. You know the plan. He says, look, we're going to kill these people. We're going to start. He starts with the midwives. It was just going to kind of be just the midwives. Like when you guys deliver a baby, if it's a boy, kill it. Proverbs 21 and 30, no wisdom, no understanding, no counsel can avail against the Lord. The plan didn't work. The midwives feared God more than they feared what would happen. And if God be for us, it doesn't matter who's against us, brothers and sisters. Look what Exodus 1, verses 20 through 21 says. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, He gave them families. Here we see the positive side of the law of sowing and reaping. We see it again. They were faithful to God. They feared God. They refused the command of Pharaoh to sin against God, to kill innocent babies. And because of that, they reaped what they sowed. And God gave them favor. In verse 22, you'll find that Pharaoh actually says to the midwives, why'd you do this? And so now he talks to everybody. Look what it says in verse 22. Then Pharaoh commanded all the people. All the people. That's what Pharaoh says about it. Everybody you need to know, all of you have been commissioned now, that every son that's born of the Hebrews, you're going to cast it into the Nile. That's his next plan. Plan 1 failed. Next week, we're going to see how God thwarts this plan, in some ways even uses this plan about throwing boys into the Nile to bring about God's purpose. Next week, chapter 2, I want to encourage you to study chapter 2 next week, and we will continue our study of Exodus.